The well was supposed to be dry. That's what everyone said. That's what the deed promised. But when Malachi Brooks lowered his rope down into the darkness, something metal scraped against stone 30 feet below. Something that shouldn't have been there. Something that made a sound no dried well should make. He stood at the edge of the abandoned ranch, sweat dripping from his weathered face as he stared into the black circle of stones. 3 days ago, he'd signed papers for this place that nobody wanted. Free land, they said. Free because no one else would take it. Free because of what happened here 20 years ago. Malachi pulled the rope back up, his calloused hands working methodically. At the bottom hung his water bucket, and it was heavy. Too heavy for an empty well. He set it down on the cracked earth and stared at what he'd brought up from the depths. Water. Clear, cold water that sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. But underneath the water, something glinted, something small and metallic that caught the light like a piece of broken mirror. Malachi reached into the bucket, his fingers closing around the object. It was warm to the touch, warmer than it should have been after sitting in cold well water. A gold coin. Old, worn smooth on one side, but with markings he couldn't quite make out. The kind of coin he'd never seen before despite his 35 years working every farm and ranch from here to the territorial border. He turned it over in his palm, studying the strange symbols etched into the metal. They looked like letters, but not any alphabet he recognized. The coin felt heavier than gold should feel, denser somehow, as if it were made of something else entirely. Malachi looked back down into the well. If there was one coin, there might be more. And if there were more coins, it might explain why this ranch had been abandoned so suddenly. Why Sterling Boon had disappeared without a trace. Why the local folks crossed themselves when they mentioned this place. He dropped the coin into his shirt pocket and felt its weight settle against his chest. The metal was cold against his skin through the thin fabric. He'd lost his own farm to debt collectors 3 months ago. His wife had taken their children and gone back to her family in the east. This abandoned ranch was his last chance to build something, to prove he wasn't the failure everyone said he was. But as he prepared to lower the bucket again, a voice called out from behind him. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Malachi spun around to see a woman approaching on horseback. She was maybe 40 years old, with steel gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to know too much. Her riding dress was practical but well-made, the kind worn by someone who had money but wasn't afraid to work. "Cora Maddox," she said, dismounting with fluid grace. "I own the spread just east of here. Been watching you since you arrived." Malachi Brooks. He kept his hand near his pocket, feeling the warmth of the coin through the fabric. "Just trying to get some water flowing. Man's got to drink." Cora walked closer to the well, her eyes never leaving the dark opening. "That well's been trouble since the day it was dug. Sterling Boon learned that the hard way." What happened to Boon? Nobody knows for certain. One day he was here, working the land, talking about striking it rich. Next day, he was gone. Left everything behind. Clothes still hanging in the house, food still on the table, horse still in the corral. Malachi felt the coin pulse against his chest, a rhythmic warmth that seemed to match his heartbeat. Maybe he just decided to move on. Man's got a right to change his mind. Cora shook her head slowly. Sterling Boon wasn't the type to run from anything. He was the kind of man who'd fight a mountain if it got in his way. But something about this place changed him those last few weeks. Something about that well. She pointed down into the darkness and Malachi could swear he heard something moving down there. Not water. Something else. Something that made his skin crawl even as the coin in his pocket grew warmer. "What kind of trouble are we talking about?" he asked. "The kind that makes a man disappear in the middle of the night, leaving behind everything he ever cared about." Cora stepped closer to the well's edge, her boot heels clicking against the worn stones. Sterling started acting strange about 6 weeks before he vanished. Stopped coming to town for supplies. Stopped talking to his neighbors. When folks did see him, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. Malachi shifted uncomfortably, the coin in his pocket seeming to burn hotter against his skin. Maybe he was just working hard. Ranch life can wear a man down. This was different. Cora's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "My farmhand Jebediah came by to help Sterling with some fence repairs. Found him sitting right here by this well, talking to himself. Not just mumbling, mind you. Having full conversations, like someone was talking back." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the abandoned ranch, but even in the heat, Malachi felt a chill run down his spine. He pulled the bucket up from the well again. noting how the rope felt heavier than before. When it emerged, the water inside was darker somehow, though it had been crystal clear just minutes ago. Jebediah said Sterling kept talking about finding something that would change everything, make him the richest man in the territory. But when Jeb asked what he'd found, Sterling would just smile and say the well was telling him secrets. Malachi set the bucket down harder than necessary, water sloshing over the sides. Wells don't tell secrets, Mrs. Maddox. They just hold water. That's what I thought, too. Cora reached into her riding jacket and pulled out a small cloth bundle. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing another gold coin identical to the one burning in Malachi's pocket. Until I found this in my chicken coop 3 days after Sterling disappeared. Malachi's breath caught in his throat. The coin in Cora's palm was exactly the same as his own, down to the strange markings and unusual weight. But how had it gotten to her property? Where exactly did you find it? Strangest thing. My chickens had stopped laying, so I went to check what was wrong. Found this buried in the dirt floor of the coop, maybe 6 inches down. The hens wouldn't go near that corner afterward. Had to move them to a different building entirely. Malachi pulled his own coin from his pocket, holding it up to compare. The 2 pieces of gold caught the sunlight identically, casting the same strange shadows with markings that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. There are more, he said quietly. More what? More coins. Down there. He nodded toward the well. I can feel them. Cora took a step back, wrapping her coin quickly and tucking it away. That's exactly what Sterling said the day before he vanished. Word for word. Something in her tone made Malachi look up sharply. What aren't you telling me? Sterling wasn't the first owner of this ranch to disappear, Malachi. The man before him, Samuel Delaney, vanished under similar circumstances 15 years ago. Left behind a wife and 2 children, who swore he'd been acting strange in the weeks before, talking about finding treasure in the well. The coin in Malachi's hand felt heavy and solid, but he couldn't bring himself to let go of it. And before Delaney? Before Delaney, this land sat empty for 20 years. Nobody knows who owned it first, but local folks have stories. Stories about people who come here looking for easy wealth and end up... She trailed off, her eyes fixed on something behind Malachi's shoulder. He turned to follow her gaze and saw fresh horse tracks in the dust leading away from the ranch. Tracks that hadn't been there when they'd been talking just moments before. Tracks that seemed to circle the well 3 times before heading toward the distant hills. Those weren't there before, Malachi said. Cora was already mounting her horse, her face pale. I need to get back to my ranch, and if you're smart, you'll pack up and leave this place tonight. But even as she spoke, Malachi knew he couldn't leave. Not with more coins waiting in the depths below. Not when he was so close to solving the mystery that had claimed at least 2 men before him. After Cora rode away, Malachi stood alone beside the well as shadows lengthened across the abandoned ranch. The coin in his pocket felt heavy against his ribs, a constant reminder of what he'd discovered. He needed answers, and the only place to find them was down in that dark hole. He tied his rope to the well's stone rim and tested the knot twice. If there were more coins down there, he had to retrieve them before nightfall. His empty stomach reminded him that he hadn't eaten since dawn, but hunger would have to wait. Whatever was in that well might be his only chance to rebuild his life. Malachi lowered himself over the edge, boots scraping against the rough stone walls as he descended. The well was deeper than he'd expected, maybe 40 feet to the bottom. As he dropped lower, the afternoon sunlight above became a distant circle, and the air grew noticeably cooler. His boots touched something solid, but it wasn't water. The bottom of the well was filled with loose dirt and debris, as if someone had been digging here recently. He struck a match and held it up, the flickering flame revealing scratches in the stone walls. Tool marks. Someone had been chipping away at the walls systematically. The match burned down to his fingers, and he lit another. In the brief illumination, he saw them. More gold coins scattered in the dirt at his feet. Maybe 20 or 30 pieces glinting in the matchlight. But they weren't just lying there randomly. They formed a rough circle around something buried in the center. Malachi knelt and began digging with his hands, pushing aside loose earth and pebbles. His fingers found the edge of something wooden. A box. Small, maybe the size of a book, but heavy, very heavy. He tucked the box inside his jacket and began gathering the coins, stuffing them into his pockets until the weight made his pants sag. The matches burned down, one by one as he worked, each flame revealing more treasure than he'd ever dreamed of possessing. But as he prepared to climb back up, His final match illuminated something that made his blood run cold. Scratched into the stone wall, almost hidden by shadows, were words carved in rough letters. "They're watching. They know what I found. If something happens to me, look for the real treasure in the old church foundation. S.B. Sterling Boon." The previous owner had left a message. Malachi climbed up faster than he'd descended, his heart pounding against the heavy coins in his pockets. When he hauled himself over the rim, full darkness had fallen across the ranch. Stars glittered overhead, but the familiar constellation seemed wrong somehow, shifted from where they should be. He lit his oil lamp and examined the wooden box by its yellow glow. The wood was old, weathered, but the iron hinges still worked. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a letter written in a shaky hand. "To whoever finds this," the letter began, "my name is Sterling Boon, and if you're reading this, I'm probably dead. The coins in this well aren't treasure. They're bait. Someone's been using them to lure people to this ranch for years, maybe decades. I figured it out too late. They've been watching me for weeks now, waiting for the right moment. The real treasure isn't gold. It's information. Information that certain people will kill to keep secret." Malachi's hands trembled as he read on. "Check the old church foundation half a mile north of here. Look for the loose stone marked with an X. What's hidden there will explain everything. But be careful. They know when someone finds the coins. They're probably already watching you." A branch snapped in the darkness beyond the lamplight. Then another. Malachi quickly folded the letter and shoved it into his jacket with the box. He doused the lamp and crouched beside the well, listening. Footsteps. Multiple sets moving carefully through the scrub brush around the ranch house. They were trying to be quiet, but the desert night amplified every sound. Someone had been watching him, just as Sterling Boon's letter warned. And now they were closing in. Malachi moved away from the well as quietly as possible, the coins jingling softly in his pockets despite his careful steps. The ranch house stood 30 yards away, a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. If he could reach it without being detected, he might be able to slip out the back and make his way to his horse. The footsteps were getting closer now, at least 3 different people moving in a coordinated pattern around the property. These weren't casual trespassers or drifters looking for shelter. They moved with purpose, like men who knew exactly where they were going and what they expected to find. Malachi reached the front porch of the abandoned house and crept up the wooden steps, testing each board before putting his full weight down. The front door hung open on rusted hinges, revealing the dark interior that Cora had described. Sterling Boon's belongings were still here, covered in dust but untouched by scavengers. A coffee cup sat on the kitchen table, still stained brown inside. A shirt hung on a wooden peg by the door. Boots waited beside the bed as if their owner had just stepped out for a moment and would return any minute. The scene felt frozen in time, like a photograph of a life interrupted. But Malachi didn't have time to examine the house properly. Through the broken window, he could see dark shapes moving between the outbuildings. One man carried a lantern, keeping it low to avoid casting light too far. Another had what looked like a rifle slung across his back. He needed to get to his horse, which he'd tied to a post behind the house near the old corral. From there, he could ride north to find the church foundation Sterling Boon had mentioned in his letter. Whatever was hidden there might explain why these men were hunting anyone who discovered the coins. Malachi slipped through the house to the back door, stepping carefully over creaking floorboards. His horse, a sturdy brown mare named Patience, waited where he'd left her. She nickered softly when she saw him approaching, and he whispered soothing words while untying her reins. As he prepared to mount, a voice called out from the darkness behind him. "That's far enough, friend." Malachi froze, his foot in the stirrup. The voice was calm, conversational, but carried the kind of authority that came from holding a weapon. "Turn around slow, and keep your hands where I can see them." Malachi turned to face 3 men emerging from the shadows. The one in the middle was tall and lean, wearing a black coat despite the warm night. His companions flanked him on either side, both carrying rifles pointed in Malachi's direction. "Name's Fletcher Knox," the tall man said. "I represent certain business interests in this territory, interests that have a stake in what happens on this property. I'm just passing through," Malachi said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Stop for water and shelter." Fletcher smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, I think we both know that's not entirely truthful. See, we've been keeping an eye on this place ever since Sterling Boon disappeared, waiting for the next curious soul to come poking around that well." One of the other men stepped closer, lantern light revealing a scarred face and cold eyes. Check his pockets, Fletcher. Bet we'll find what we're looking for. The weight of the coin suddenly felt enormous, pulling at Malachi's jacket and pants like lead weights. These men knew exactly what he'd found down there, which meant they'd been watching him for longer than he'd realized. "The coins aren't what you really want, are they?" Malachi said, remembering Sterling Boon's letter. "They're just bait to draw people here." Fletcher's smile widened. Smart man. Smarter than Boon was, anyway. He figured it out too, but by then it was too late to do him any good. "What happened to Sterling?" "Same thing that's going to happen to you if you don't cooperate. See, there are some secrets in this territory that certain people prefer to keep buried. Secrets worth more than all the gold coins in that well." The man with the scarred face raised his rifle slightly. "Should we just handle this here, Fletcher? Save ourselves the trouble?" But Fletcher held up a hand. "Not yet. Our friend here might be, especially if he's smart enough to understand the situation." Malachi's mind raced. Sterling Boon had mentioned the church foundation, but these men didn't seem to know about that part of the message. If he could somehow get away, he might still have a chance to find whatever information had gotten him killed. "What kind of cooperation are you talking about?" he asked. Fletcher reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of paper. Even in the dim lantern light, Malachi could see it was some kind of official document, stamped and sealed. The kind that involves you signing over any claim to this property and forgetting you ever found anything in that well. Malachi stared at the document Fletcher held out, trying to read the legal language in the dim lantern light. The paper appeared to be a land deed transfer, but the names and details were hard to make out. What he could see made his stomach turn. Someone wanted legal ownership of this ranch, and they were willing to threaten people to get it. "I don't understand," Malachi said, buying time while his mind raced. "If you want the property so badly, why not just buy it from whoever owns it now?" Fletcher laughed, a dry sound that carried no humor. "Because the current situation is complicated. See, when Sterling Boon disappeared, he left behind some debts. Debts to people who don't take kindly to not being paid. This ranch is collateral, but there are legal complications about ownership when someone vanishes without a trace." The scarred man stepped closer, rifle still trained on Malachi. "Enough talking, Fletcher. Let's just take what we came for and be done with it. Patience, Reuben. Our friend here is going to be reasonable." Fletcher's eyes never left Malachi's face. "You see, if someone with a legitimate claim to the property were to sign it over voluntarily, it would simplify things considerably. Someone like a new settler who found the place abandoned and decided to make it his home." Malachi felt the weight of the coins in his pockets and remembered Sterling Boon's letter hidden in his jacket. These men knew about the coins, but they didn't seem to know about the message or the church foundation. That gave him one advantage, if he could figure out how to use it. "What makes you think I have any legal claim to this place?" he asked. "Territorial law says any citizen can claim abandoned property if they work it for 30 days and file the proper papers. You've been here for what, 3 days? Close enough for our purposes, especially with the right witness statements." Fletcher reached into his other pocket and pulled out a second document. "This is a sworn statement that you've been working this ranch for over a month. All it needs is your signature, and it becomes official. Then you sign the transfer, and everyone walks away happy. And if I refuse?" The third man, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was rough, like gravel in a bucket. "Then you'll end up like Boon and Delaney, disappeared without a trace, leaving behind all your belongings and no forwarding address." Malachi's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket where Sterling's letter was hidden, but he caught himself. "You killed them. We prefer to think of it as solving problems," Fletcher said. "Boon and Delaney were greedy. They found the coins and started asking questions instead of being satisfied with their good fortune. That made them liabilities." "What questions?" Fletcher exchanged glances with his companions. "Questions about where the coins came from. Questions about who put them there and why. Questions about certain business arrangements that are better left unexamined." Reuben shifted impatiently, the rifle barrel catching moonlight. "Fletcher, we're wasting time. This one's already seen too much." "Maybe," Fletcher agreed, "but he might still be useful. You see, Malachi, the coins in that well aren't random. They're payment. Payment for services rendered to certain parties who value discretion above all else." The pieces began falling into place in Malachi's mind. The coins weren't treasure at all. They were evidence of something illegal, something worth killing to protect. Someone had been using this isolated ranch as a meeting place or storage location, and the previous owners had stumbled onto the operation. "What kind of services?" he asked. Fletcher smiled again, but this time there was something predatory in his expression. The kind that involved moving certain goods across the territorial border without the involvement of customs officials. The kind that generates substantial profits for everyone involved, as long as certain secrets remain buried. Smuggling. That explained everything. The isolated location, the pattern of disappearances, the valuable coins used as payment or bribes. Someone was running contraband through this area, and the ranch served as a way station or meeting point. "The church foundation," Malachi said without thinking. Fletcher's smile vanished instantly. "What did you say?" Too late, Malachi realized his mistake. Sterling Boon's letter had mentioned the church foundation, but these men weren't supposed to know about that. Now they knew he'd found more than just coins. Reuben raised his rifle to his shoulder. "He knows about the drop site." Fletcher held up a hand, but his eyes were hard as flint. "Where did you hear about the church foundation?" "Malachi?" Malachi's mind raced as he realized how much danger he'd put himself in with that slip. Fletcher and his men clearly didn't know about Sterling Boon's letter, which meant they hadn't searched the well thoroughly after his disappearance. Now they knew he'd found additional information beyond the coins. "I overheard some talk in town," Malachi lied, trying to keep his voice steady. "People mentioned an old church foundation somewhere around here. Figured it might be a landmark to help me navigate." Fletcher studied his face for a long moment, clearly trying to decide whether to believe him. "What people? What exactly did they say?" "Just general talk. Someone mentioned ruins from an old settlement, said to stay away from them because the ground was unstable." The third man, the one with the gravelly voice, stepped forward. "He's lying, Fletcher. Nobody in town knows about that place except us and our contacts." "I think you're right. Caleb." Fletcher's hand moved to the pistol at his hip. "Which means our friend here has been more thorough in his exploration than he's letting on. Strip him down and search him properly." Reuben moved toward Malachi, but at that moment, a horse's whinny echoed across the ranch from the direction of the main road. All four men froze, listening as hoofbeats approached through the darkness. "Someone's coming," Reuben whispered. Fletcher cursed under his breath. "Get him out of sight. If this is one of our contacts arriving early, they can't see him." Caleb grabbed Malachi's arm and hauled him toward the ranch house. The rifle barrel pressed against his back. "Move, and don't try anything clever, or you'll be eating lead." They reached the front porch just as a rider came into view, a lone figure on horseback approaching slowly. In the moonlight, Malachi could make out the silhouette of someone wearing a hat and long coat, but the distance made it impossible to identify who it was. Fletcher walked out to meet the newcomer, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. "You're early," he called out. The rider dismounted about 20 feet away, staying in the shadows beyond the lantern light. "Had to change the schedule. Federal marshals are sniffing around the border crossings. Too risky to wait until tomorrow night." The voice was cultured, educated, nothing like the rough frontier accent Malachi had expected. This was someone with money and position, not a common smuggler. "Do you have the merchandise?" Fletcher asked. "In the wagon about a mile back. But I'm concerned about security. There are too many variables, too many people asking questions." Fletcher glanced back toward the house where Malachi was hidden. "We've had a complication. Another drifter found the well. Handle it the same way you handled the others." The rider's voice was cold, matter of fact. "We can't afford any loose ends, not with this much money at stake." "Of course. But first, we need to know what he's discovered." He mentioned the church foundation. Even in the darkness, Malachi could sense the rider's tension. "That's impossible. Only 3 people know about that location, and 2 of them are standing right here." "Then we have a serious problem," Fletcher said, "because our friend definitely knows something he shouldn't." The rider remounted his horse. "I'll bring the wagon up. Get whatever information you can out of him, then dispose of the body like we discussed. Make it look like he fell into the well accidentally. What about his horse and belongings? Sell them in the next territory over. And Fletcher, make sure this is the last time we have to clean up your messes. This operation is too profitable to risk because you can't keep curious settlers away from the property." As the rider spurred his horse back toward the road, Caleb shoved Malachi through the front door of the ranch house. The wooden floor creaked under their feet as they entered the dark interior that still smelled of dust and abandonment. "Sit down and keep quiet," Caleb growled, pointing to one of Sterling Boon's old chairs. "Fletcher's going to want to have a long conversation with you about what you've seen and who you've told." Malachi sat down heavily, the coins in his pockets clanking softly against the chair. Through the broken window, he could see Fletcher and Reuben talking in low voices by the well. In a few minutes, they would come inside and begin questioning him seriously. Once they found Sterling's letter and realized how much he actually knew, his life would be measured in hours, not days. He had to find a way to escape before the mysterious rider returned with his wagon full of contraband. But with 3 armed men watching him and his horse tied up outside, his options were running dangerously short. Malachi sat in the dusty chair, his mind racing through possible escape routes. The ranch house had 2 doors, front and back, but Fletcher and Reuben were positioned where they could see both exits. The windows were small and high, designed to keep out desert heat rather than provide easy passage for a grown man. But Sterling Boon had lived here for months and he'd been smart enough to leave a warning message. Maybe he'd been smart enough to plan an escape route too. Caleb stood near the front window, rifle cradled in his arms, occasionally glancing outside to check on his partners. His attention was focused on the conversation happening by the well, giving Malachi a chance to study the interior of the house more carefully. In the dim light filtering through the broken windows, he could see that the floorboards near the back wall looked different from the rest. Some were newer, less weathered, as if they'd been replaced recently. Sterling might have hidden something under there, or created a way out through the floor. The sound of approaching wagon wheels made Caleb straighten and peer out the window. "Fletcher, the boss is coming back with the merchandise." Fletcher's voice carried clearly in the still night air. "Good. Reuben, help me get our guest ready for questioning. Time to find out exactly what he knows." Malachi heard footsteps approaching the front porch. In seconds they would be inside, and his opportunity for escape would vanish completely. He had to act now, while Caleb was still distracted by the activity outside. Moving as quietly as possible, Malachi slipped out of the chair and crept toward the back wall. The floorboards creaked softly under his weight, but the sound was masked by the wagon wheels and horse hooves outside. When he reached the newer boards, he knelt and ran his fingers along the edges. One board was loose, sitting in place, but not nailed down. Malachi lifted it carefully, revealing a shallow space underneath. Inside was a leather satchel wrapped in oiled cloth, along with a small crowbar that Sterling had apparently used to pry up the floorboard. The front door creaked open as Fletcher and Reuben entered the house. Malachi quickly grabbed the satchel and crowbar, replacing the board just as Caleb turned around. "Where do you think you're going?" Caleb raised his rifle. Instead of answering, Malachi swung the crowbar at the nearest window. Glass shattered outward, creating a jagged opening barely large enough for a man to squeeze through. Before Caleb could react, Malachi dove headfirst through the broken window, ignoring the sharp edges that tore at his clothes and skin. He hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact. Behind him, shouting erupted from inside the house as the 3 men realized their prisoner had escaped. Malachi scrambled to his feet and ran toward the back of the property, clutching Sterling's satchel against his chest. Gunshots rang out, bullets whining past his head and kicking up dirt at his feet. But it was dark, and he was moving fast, making him a difficult target. He reached the old corral where his horse waited and vaulted into the saddle without bothering to untie the reins properly. "Find him!" Fletcher's voice roared across the ranch. "He can't get far on foot." But Malachi was already spurring his mare toward the northern hills, following the direction Sterling Boon had indicated in his letter. Behind him, he could hear horses being saddled and men cursing as they prepared to give chase. The church foundation was supposed to be half a mile north of the ranch. In the moonlight, the desert landscape looked alien and confusing, with every rock formation and clump of sagebrush casting deceptive shadows. But Malachi had spent his whole life navigating by the stars, and the North Star provided a reliable guide even in his desperate flight. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, he spotted the ruins Sterling had described. The remains of an old stone foundation formed a rough rectangle in a small valley, with what looked like the remnants of a bell tower rising from one corner. This had once been a church, probably built by some long-forgotten settlement that had failed to survive the harsh frontier conditions. Malachi dismounted and approached the ruins on foot, leading his horse. According to Sterling's letter, he needed to look for a loose stone marked with an X. In the moonlight, the task seemed impossible. There were hundreds of stones in the crumbling walls, and most bore scratches and marks from decades of weathering. But as he circled the foundation, his fingers trailing along the rough stone surfaces, he found what he was looking for. On the north wall, about 3 feet from the ground, someone had carved a clear X into one of the larger stones. When Malachi pushed against it, the stone shifted slightly. Using Sterling's crowbar, he pried the marked stone loose. Behind it was a hollow space containing a metal box similar to the one he'd found in the well, but larger. This one was heavy enough to require both hands to lift out. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made him look up sharply. Fletcher and his men had found his trail. Malachi quickly opened the metal box as the hoofbeats grew louder. Inside were dozens of documents, letters, and what appeared to be financial ledgers. Even in the moonlight, he could see enough to understand what Sterling Boon had discovered. These were records of a massive smuggling operation involving stolen government supplies, illegal weapon sales, and contraband moving across territorial borders. But more importantly, the papers contained names, real names of people in positions of authority who were part of the conspiracy. Territorial officials, customs agents, even a federal judge. Sterling had documented everything, creating a complete record of corruption that reached far beyond a simple ranch in the desert. Fletcher and his men appeared at the top of the small valley, their horses silhouetted against the star-filled sky. They had found him, but now Malachi held the evidence that could destroy their entire operation. "That's far enough," Malachi called out, standing up with the box clearly visible in his hands. "I know what you've been doing, and I have proof." Fletcher rode closer, his pistol drawn. "Hand over that box, and we might let you live long enough to regret finding it." "I don't think so." Malachi pulled out one of the documents and held it up. "This letter is signed by Judge Morrison, authorizing payment for stolen Army rifles. This ledger shows payments to Customs Agent Williams for ignoring shipments at the border crossing. You're not just smugglers. You're part of a conspiracy involving half the territorial government." Reuben raised his rifle, but Fletcher held up a hand to stop him. "Those papers don't mean anything without someone to present them to the right authorities, and dead men don't testify." "True," Malachi agreed, "but I'm not the only one who knows about this now." He reached into Sterling's satchel and pulled out several sheets of paper. "Before I came here tonight, I made copies of Sterling Boon's letter and sent them to 3 different newspapers in 3 different territories. If I don't return by tomorrow morning, those editors will receive very detailed instructions about where to find this evidence." It was a complete lie, but Fletcher had no way of knowing that. Malachi watched the uncertainty creep across the man's face as he considered the implications. "You're bluffing. Maybe. But are you willing to bet your life on it? Because if those newspapers start investigating, how long do you think it'll take before they connect you to the missing ranchers? How long before they start asking Judge Morrison and Agent Williams some very uncomfortable questions?" Caleb spurred his horse forward. "Fletcher, we can't let him leave with those documents." But Fletcher was already holstering his weapon. "No, the risk is too great. If he's telling the truth about those letters, killing him now would only make things worse. So what do we do?" Fletcher stared at Malachi for a long moment. "We pack up the operation and disappear. Tonight, burn everything at the ranch and scatter in different directions." "What about the boss? What about the merchandise in the wagon?" "The boss will have to cut his losses. This operation is finished." Malachi kept the box clutched against his chest as the 3 men turned their horses and rode away into the darkness. He waited until the sound of hoofbeats had completely faded before allowing himself to breathe normally again. 3 months later, Malachi Brooks stood in the federal courthouse in the territorial capital, watching as Judge Morrison was led away in shackles. The documents from Sterling Boon's hidden cache had provided everything the federal marshals needed to unravel the entire smuggling conspiracy. 12 men had been arrested, including 2 territorial officials and 3 customs agents. Fletcher Knox and his partners had vanished without a trace, but their operation was finished forever. The abandoned ranch now legally belonged to Malachi, along with a substantial reward from the territorial government for exposing the corruption. He'd used the money to bring his wife and children back from the east and to build the ranch into a profitable operation. Sterling Boon and Samuel Delaney were officially declared dead, victims of the criminal conspiracy they'd accidentally uncovered. Their families received compensation from the territorial treasury, and their names were cleared of any suspicion of wrongdoing. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Malachi would walk out to the old well and remember the night that changed his life. The well still held water, clear and cold, but the gold coins were long gone, turned over to federal authorities as evidence. He'd found something far more valuable than treasure in that dark hole. He'd found justice, and a chance to build the life he'd always wanted. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale, where courage and destiny collide in unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.